Vygotsky's cognitive development. From the time Piaget's work first became known to large numbers of American psychologists in the early 1960s until the 1980s, it was the dominant explanation of cognitive development. Not that Piaget didn't have his critics. As the previous section made clear, many psychologists challenged one aspect or another of his work, but there were no competing explanations of cognitive development. Beginning in the early 1980s, however, the ideas of Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky began to appear in the psychological literature with increasing frequency. Vygotsky, who died from tuberculosis in 1934, was a contemporary of Piaget, who had very different views about the major forces that shaped learning and thinking, particularly with respect to the roles of culture, social interaction, and formal instruction. How one's culture affects cognitive development. Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development is often referred to as a socio-cultural theory because it maintains that how we think is a function of both social and cultural forces. If, for example, you were given a list of nouns such as plate, box, peach, knife, apple, hoe, cup, and potato, and told to create groupings, you would probably place plate, knife, and cup in a group labeled utensils, and peach, apple, and potato in a group labeled food. Why? Is there something inherently compelling about those groupings? Not really. We could just as logically have put plate, knife, and apple in a group because we can use the first two or eat the third. But we are more likely to put objects in taxonomic categories than in functional categories because we have been taught by others who organize items taxonomically most of the time. And why do we think that way? Because we are the product of a culture that prizes the ability of its members to think at the most abstract levels, which is why Piaget saw formal operations as the most advanced stage of thinking. Typically, then, parents and schools shape children's thought processes to reflect that which the culture values. So even when individuals are by themselves, what they think and do is the result of cultural values and practices, some of which may stretch back over hundreds or thousands of years, as well as recent social social contacts. The importance of psychological tools. Vygotsky believed that the most important things a culture passes on to its members and their descendants are what he called psychological tools. These are the cognitive devices and procedures with which we communicate and explore the world around us. They both aid and change our mental functioning. Speech, writing, gestures, diagrams, numbers, chemical formulas, musical notation, rules, and memory techniques are some examples of common psychological tools. Early explorers, for example, created maps to help them represent where they had been, communicate that knowledge to others, and plan future trips. Today we use the same type of tool to navigate efficiently over long distances or within relatively compact but complex environments like large cities. Another example is the use of multiplication. If asked to solve the multiplication problem 343 times 822, you would, in all likelihood, quickly and easily come up with the answer, 281,946, by using the following procedure. But you could have produced the same answer by adding 343 to itself 821 times. Why would you automatically opt for the first procedure? Because the culture in which you operate has, through the medium of formal instruction, provided you with a psychological tool called multiplication as a means of more efficiently and accurately solving certain types of complex mathematical problems. Children are introduced to a culture's major psychological tools through social interactions with their parents, and later through more formal interactions with classroom teachers. Eventually, these social interactions are internalized as cognitive processes that are autonomously invoked. As Vygotsky so elegantly put it, Through others, we become ourselves. How social interaction affects cognitive development. The difference between Vygotsky's views on the origin and development of cognitive processes and those of other cognitive developmental psychologists is something like the old question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Influenced by Piaget, many developmental psychologists argue that as children overcome cognitive conflict through the internal processes of assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration, they become more capable of higher level thinking, and so they come to understand better the nature of the world in which they live and their place in it. In other words, cognitive development makes social development possible. See our discussion of Robert Selman's work on the social development of children in the next chapter. Vygotsky, however, believed that just the opposite was true. He saw social interaction as the primary cause of cognitive development. Unlike Piaget, Vygotsky believed that children gained significantly from the knowledge and conceptual tools handed down to them by those who are more intellectually advanced, whether they are same-age peers, older children, or adults. Consider, for example, a simple concept like grandmother. In the absence of formal instruction, a primary grade child's concept of grandmother is likely to be narrow in scope because it is based on personal experience. My grandmother is 70 years old, has gray hair, wears glasses, and makes the best apple pie. But when children are helped to understand the basic nature of the concept with such instructional tools as family tree diagrams, they understand the notion of grandmother and other types of relatives on a broader and more general basis. They can then use this concept to compare family structures with friends and later to do genealogical research. For social interactions to produce advances in cognitive development, Vygotsky argued they have to contain a process called mediation. Mediation occurs when a more knowledgeable individual interprets a child's behavior and helps transform it into an internal and symbolic representation that means the same thing to the child as to others. Perhaps the following example will help clarify this point. Imagine a child who reaches out to grasp an object that is beyond her reach. A nearby parent thinks the child is pointing at the object and says, "Oh, you want the box of crayons," and retrieves the item for the child. Over time, what began as a grasping action becomes transformed through the mediation of an adult into an internalized sign. I want you to give that object to me. That means the same thing to the child as it does to the adult. Thus, a child's potential level of mental development can be brought about only by introducing the more advanced thought processes of another person. How instruction affects cognitive development. Vygotsky drew a distinction between the type of information that preschool children learn and the type of information that children who attend school learn, or should learn. During early childhood, children acquire what Vygotsky called spontaneous concepts. That is, they learn various facts and concepts and rules, such as how to speak one's native language and how to classify objects in one's environment, but they do so for the most part as a byproduct of such other activities as engaging in play and communicating with parents and playmates. This kind of knowledge is unsystematic, unconscious, and directed at the child's everyday concrete experiences. Hence Vygotsky's use of the term spontaneous. Schooling, however, should be directed to the learning of what Vygotsky called scientific concepts. Scientific concepts are the psychological tools that allow us to manipulate our environment consciously and systematically. Vygotsky believed that the proper development of a child's mind depends on learning how to use these psychological tools, and this will occur only if classroom instruction is properly designed. This means providing students with explicit and clear verbal definitions as a first step. The basic purpose of instruction, then, is not simply to add one piece of knowledge to another, like pennies in a piggy bank, but to stimulate and guide cognitive development. Contemporary psychologists have extended Vygotsky's notions of spontaneous and scientific concepts. They use the term empirical learning to refer to the way in which young children acquire spontaneous concepts. The hallmark of empirical learning is that the most observable characteristics of objects and events are noticed and used as a basis for forming general concepts. The main limitation of this approach is that salient characteristics are not necessarily critical or defining characteristics, and it is the latter that form the basis of correct conception formation. For example, in the absence of formal instruction, children come to believe that any utterance that has two or more words is a sentence, that whales are fish, and that bamboo is not a type of grass. Theoretical learning, on the other hand, involves using psychological tools to learn scientific concepts. As these general tools are used repeatedly with various problems, they are gradually internalized and generalized to a wide variety of settings and problem types. Good quality instruction, in this view, is aimed at helping children move from the very practical empirical learning to the more general theoretical learning, and from using psychological tools overtly, with the aid of an adult, to using these tools mentally, without outside assistance. Here's an example that compares the efficacy of the empirical and theoretical approaches. Two groups of 6-year-old children were taught how to write the 22 letters of the Russian alphabet. Group 1 was taught using the empirical approach. The teacher gave the students a model of each letter, showed them how to write each one, and gave a verbal explanation of how to write each letter. The students then copied each letter under the teacher's supervision. When they produced an acceptable copy of a letter, they were taught the next letter. Group 2 was taught using the theoretical approach. First, students were taught to analyze the shape of each letter so they could identify where the direction of the contour of each line changed. Then they were to place dots in those locations, outlining the change in contour. Finally, they were to reproduce the pattern of dots on another part of the page and connect the dots with a pencil. The speed with which the children in each group learned to accurately produce the letters of the alphabet differed by quite a large margin. The average student in the empirical group needed about 170 trials to learn the first letter, and about 20 trials to write the last letter. The number of trials taken to learn all 22 letters was about 1,230. The average student in the theoretical group required only about 14 trials to learn how to write the first letter correctly, and from the 8th letter on needed only 1 trial per letter. The number of trials needed to learn all 22 letters for the second group was about 60. Furthermore, these students were able to use the general method they were taught to help them learn to write the letters of the Latin and Arabic alphabets. Instruction and the zone of proximal development. This discussion of empirical and theoretical learning illustrates Vygotsky's belief that well-designed instruction is like a magnet. If it is aimed slightly ahead of what children know and can do at the present time, it will pull them along, helping them master things they cannot learn on their own. We can illustrate this idea with an experiment that Vygotsky described. He gave 2 8-year-olds of average ability problems that were a bit too difficult for them to solve on their own. Although Vygotsky did not specify what types of problems they were, imagine that they were math problems. He then tried to help the children solve the problems by giving them leading questions and hints. He found that one child with the hints was able to solve problems designed for 12-year-olds, whereas the other child, who also received the hints, could reach only a 9-year-old level. Vygotsky referred to the difference between what a child can do on his own and what can be accomplished with some assistance as the zone of proximal development, ZPD. The size of the first 8-year-old's zone was 4. That is, the 8-year-old could, with help, solve the problem designed for a child 4 years older, whereas the second child has a zone of 1. He could solve the problem designed for a child 1 year older. According to Vygotsky, students with wider zones are likely to experience greater cognitive development when instruction is pitched just above the lower limit of their ZPD, zone of proximal development, than will students with narrower zones, because the former are in a better position to capitalize on the instruction. The zone of proximal development, then, encompasses those abilities, attitudes, and patterns of thinking that are in the process of maturing and can be refined only with assistance. Helping students answer difficult questions or solve problems by giving them hints or asking leading questions is an example of a technique called scaffolding. Just as construction workers use external scaffolding to support their building efforts, Vygotsky recommended that teachers similarly support learning in its early phases. The purpose of scaffolding is to help students acquire knowledge and skills they would not have learned on their own. As the student demonstrates mastery over the content in question, the learning aids are faded and removed. Scaffolding techniques that are likely to help students traverse their zone of proximal development include prompts, suggestions, checklists, modeling, rewards, feedback, cognitive structuring, using such devices as theories, categories, labels, and rules for helping students organize and understand ideas, and questioning. As students approach the upper limit of their zone of proximal development, their behavior becomes smoother, more internalized, and more automatized. Any assistance offered at this level will likely be perceived as disruptive and irritating. Mark Tappan has proposed the following 4-component model that teachers can use to optimize the effects of their scaffolding efforts and help students move through their zone of proximal development. Number 1, model desired academic behaviors. Children can imitate many behaviors that they do not have the capacity or the capability to exhibit independently, and such experiences stimulate them to act this way on their own. Number 2, create a dialogue with the student. A child's understanding of concepts, procedures, and principles becomes more systematic and organized as a result of the exchange of questions, explanations, and feedback between teacher and child within the child's zone of proximal development. As with modeling, the effectiveness of this dialogue is determined, at least in part, by the extent to which the teacher and student are committed to creating and maintaining a relationship in which each makes an honest effort to satisfy the needs of the other. Practice. Practice speeds up the internalizing of thinking skills that students observe and discuss with others. Confirmation. To confirm others is to bring out the best in them by focusing on what they can do with some assistance, and this process helps create a trusting and mutually supportive relationship between teacher and student. For example, you might say to a student, "I know this assignment seems difficult right now and that you have had some problems in the past with similar assignments, but with the help I'm willing to offer, I'm certain you'll do good quality work." Vygotsky's notion of producing cognitive development by embedding instruction within a student's zone of proximal development is an attractive one and has many implications for instruction. In Chapter 9, which is about social cognitive theory, for example, we will describe how this notion was used to improve the reading comprehension skills of low-achieving 7th graders. In Chapter 13, we will describe how a 4th grade teacher used various types of prompts as a form of scaffolding to help students better understand stories they had read and the effects these prompts had on subsequent discussions of reading assignments.